So who's ready to talk about high impact practices at 9:30 in the morning?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. To make this granted, it's in service. I can't make it like fun. But I'm not teaching this semester, so I have a bunch of like Rice Krispie treats and cakes and stuff that would have otherwise just sat in my office. So these are yours. I'm just going to pass these around. If you want to just take some and put them in a bag and take them back to your office, please do so. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. So hopefully these soften the blow of you having to listen to me talk about high impact practices. All right. So our outcomes for this session are pretty basic. We're going to be starting at the foundational level, talking about high impact practices, or HIPs as they are often called for their shortened version. So the goals for this session are that by the end, you'll be able to identify the different kinds of high impact practices. Very often people just say high impact practices and then don't do anything else with it. And it's like, cool, those words on their own mean nothing. You've probably seen the whiteboards around the room. We're going to be doing a lot with these. There are two that are missing from the official list. There are only so many whiteboards. And also, because we're moving away from e-portfolios, so they didn't make the cut. And then also undergraduate research is a huge high impact practice, mostly at four-year universities. So if you do some level of that, by all means, you can talk about it, but those were the two that didn't make the cut for the whiteboard. So we'll talk about the different kinds, and we will also examine how they show up here on like Mount West campus in your delivery, in your materials, and things of that nature. And if you are thinking, Morgan, I actually have no idea what HIPs look like on this campus, that's fine. I did a lot of research over the break, making sure if I was going to stand up here and talk to you about it, I wanted to make sure I knew what I was talking about. There are a lot of other institutions that have that same problem, and we'll talk about why here in a minute. But before we do that, without looking anything up, completely off the dome, what is that? Can anybody define high impact practice for me? This is not a gotcha.
A practice that has a high impact.
Yes. Anybody else want to try anything else? Show of hands. How many of you have heard of high impact practices, but you were like, it's a thing that, cool, me too. Okay. So when I go to conferences, if somebody stands in front of me and does this and uses a bunch of bullshit buzzwords, I want to walk out so bad. And one thing I've noticed at HLC in particular, which I really like about the crowd that goes to HLC, is that when this happens, a good chunk of people will just get up and leave. I'm one of those people. And similarly, too, if somebody gets up in front of a crowd and it's like, all right, now it's time for the part of the session where we're going to do group work, guaranteed 15 to 20% of the people get up and leave. I'm part of that group. Yeah, so this does not help. And I'm willing to wager most people in the room have not seen the show that this is from. Zach's probably the only other one. That's fine. It is the exact context for this gift, by the way. Somebody is doing that very thing, and the protagonist is like, I'm going to kill him with my bare hands. So in thinking about high impact practices, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the basics. So the history of high impact practices, and play in this space with me for a minute. High impact practices and a lot of education reform and the models through which we approach education are pretty similar to the ways in which literary theory progresses. So for example, when it comes to looking at literature, every like decade or so, things get a little different. There becomes a prevailing or like more popular theory. In the 2010s, for example, when I was in grad school, it was post-humanism. I'm not in grad school anymore. I'm not in the sauce. I don't know what the theory is now. But the big one at the time was post-humanism, looking at humans and their connections with technology, because it was the 2010s and we had a lot of anxiety about that. I imagine that's still happening, right? Now, in thinking about education, in 1975, the prevailing thought, and this was supported and pioneered really by a professor named Vincent Tinto, was that students needed to assimilate to the college culture. There is a specific mold these students need to fit it. Around that same time, in literary theory, we had what was referred to as new criticism. Anybody in here familiar with that concept? Yeah, I imagine like this section right now. So new criticism posits that you have a text. There's only one true meaning for that text. The Great Gatsby is about the death of the American dream. Othello can only be about this. Jane Eyre can only be about this. So if the idea is every text has one true meaning, I imagine everybody in this room can figure out why that's gonna die pretty quickly, right? What's wrong with that?
Everybody interprets it themselves.
Everybody interprets it differently.
We all think different.
We all think differently. Reader response would be the theory that came right after it, which ultimately was like, okay, whatever you bring to the text informs how you look at it. And a lot of education reform was that way too. Because if we're looking at, okay, college students, you've got a mold and every single one of you must fit this mold. That's not gonna work. So this is an image from a Junji Ito short story called The Enigma of the Amigara Fault, where our character is saying, this is my hole, it was made for me. There are lots of human-sized holes and they're all trying to shove themselves into it. I probably don't, even if you haven't read the short story, I probably don't have to explain what the short story is about. This is not difficult. And similarly, looking at education, if we're looking at, all right, your students all coming from very different backgrounds, very different experiences, but you all have to assimilate to this one thing. So there's one hole for you and you have to fit into it. That's just not gonna work, right? So that's where we are at about the 70s or so. Now this experiences criticism for a while, but it's not until the 90s that things really start to change. Due in large part to George Ko. We actually have one of his books. He's got several, but we actually have one of his books in our library right now in the Seattle. So talking more about student engagement, getting them involved, making sure that we are kind of starting to meet students where they are, as opposed to saying, all right, you're new here. I don't know if you have the resources or had the prep to get here, but you better figure it out. Again, I imagine everybody in this room is thinking, yeah, obviously that's not gonna work. So in the 2000s is when we start hearing more about high impact practices using that specific language, 2008 in particular being the big year. I would imagine all of you have seen or had a copy of that PDF that has the LEAP logo on it, that has all of the different high impact practices numbered. It's like red and yellow and white. That's 2008. So that's where that came from. And then in the 2020s, this is now like the prevailing, like dominant thought for education is that we need to be holistic. We need to be looking at the different ways in which students are coming to us. And high impact practices in particular, if we're looking at their core definition, which is as follows. High impact practices are active learning practices that can be measured based upon, quote, achievement of deep learning, significant engagement gains, and positive differential impact on historically underserved populations. So all of those groups that were really being ignored by what was going on in like the 70s and 80s, and beforehand, let's be real, being a little bit more intentional with how we handle approaching those populations when it comes to these high impact practices. So that's where they came from. That's a lot of the rationale behind it. And that's where we get this list. Now, again, 2 of these on this list did not make it to the whiteboards, but that is because they don't really apply to us anymore. But these are the ones that we see that are most common and that are in that PDF that you've likely seen before. First of which, FYS. So first year seminars are a high impact practice. Number 2, common intellectual experiences, learning communities, writing intensive courses, my favorite, collaborative assignments and projects, my least favorite as a student, undergraduate research, diversity and global learning, e-portfolios, service learning, internships, and capstone courses. So now, okay, you're probably thinking, oh, we do a lot of that, which is good. But, right, there's a big but there. I want to make sure we understand exactly how each of these breaks down before we start interrogating what's happening on Mount West campus and where some of these can fall apart. One thing that I noted in a lot of the research that I did over the break was that a lot of the researchers went into their studies thinking, all right, our hypothesis is that the implementation of these high impact practices is going to positively affect graduation rates. And a lot of them found that they didn't actually, because they weren't implemented in the right way. If you treat it as just a check in the boxes, oh yeah, we do this thing. Like you can have an FYS class, but if you just have it and it's not a good one, it might not be all that helpful. Right? You could have students do a group project, but if it's not executed in the right way, it might not go well. In fact, one of the ones that I read in particular, students rated the group projects in particular really, really, really low. Which again, some of them are just sticks in the mud. Like me, I'm always going to hate that. But again, if they're not implemented in the right way, that's when things start to fall apart. So first, let's make sure we understand what each of these means. So first year seminars. According to the AAC and U, the highest quality first-year experiences place a strong emphasis on critical inquiry, frequent writing, information literacy, collaborative learning, and other skills that develop students' intellectual and practical competencies. So often we look at FYS or College 101 as how to be a Mount West student, which is true. That part's great. But it's also how to be a college student in general and how to be able to survive once you graduate. So we did about 2 years ago an exercise with our college students in that class where we said, all right, what are some things that like you wish you knew before, like, because you're about to graduate or you're about to graduate high school. In the case of a lot of our jump starters, like, what are some things you feel like you need? You're 18, what are you missing? And the amount of students that told me, dude, I'm so afraid that I'm going to accidentally commit tax fraud. I have no idea what a W-2 is. I don't know how to pay bills. And I told them, as long as you bought something online, you know how to pay a bill. It's super easy, but we have that as part of our curriculum now. So like they understand that what utilities look like in West Virginia, what they should be expecting. We talk about problem solving, not just in the context of classrooms, but there are 4 different disaster scenarios that they are given. And by disaster, I do genuinely mean disaster. One of them is, okay, your sister's getting married, her wedding cake has been destroyed in transit. You've got 2 hours and here are your supplies. How are you gonna fix it? Or you are out on a boat with a series of other people. Here are their skills. Your buddy has been bit by a bull shark. You are 20 miles from shore. What do you do? These are ridiculous. Will they be in that situation? No, but they do need to be able to critically think. They need to know, all right, I'm not always going to have access to somebody else who is an instructor, who is in a position of power. They need to be able to think on their own. And a lot of that needs to be happening in those FYS classes. Otherwise, if it's just, this is where IT is located. Like, okay, that's good. I'm glad I know that, but it can't just be point and click. There needs to be more going on. Common intellectual experiences are ultimately shown in a couple different ways, but it's mostly moving through a scaffolded progression as they get through their classes. So thinking about their like program sheets. For example, you take English 101 and then you take English 102. You need this and then you need to do this. Very often, a lot of those common intellectual experiences come about because they are cohorted. You are in this program class and then you take this program class, usually with the next group of people. So they get to have that shared experience. And out of that, we often get what are referred to as learning communities. These are often linked by courses that have similar themes. So for example, in undergrad, I received my BA in creative writing, but I have a minor in classics. And there was a semester where I took a couple different classes that were all about not just literature in like the time of Nero and stuff like that, but they were co-taught by a classics professor and a professor from the criminal justice department. And it was super cool. And so all of those classes were about that one common theme, and all of us students took those together. So do I have as deep a knowledge of literature in the time of Nero and crime and stuff like that at that point now? No, but at the time I did, and I got to experience that with my fellow students, and that helped a lot. So when we talk about learning communities at the student level, that often is what that looks like. Those are connected. We have professors from different disciplines coming together. And if we're thinking about this, right, not just in the context of these linked courses too, these learning communities can also be created through faculty and staff on campus. One common way that CETLs do that is they have book clubs. If you guys are interested, I would love for the CETL to have a book club, maybe starting next year. Faculty decide on a book about leadership, about using data, et cetera, and they work together, they get through it, and they share their findings and what they think would be best for the college. But when we say learning community, that is what that means. A writing intensive course, likely everybody in here is familiar with that. You have to meet a set standard for what is a writing intensive course. But those ultimately emphasize not just that all writing is cyclical, which is something that I say to my students all the time. So that is ultimately positing that, no, you're not going to write a rough draft and that's going to be it. You are constantly writing and rewriting, but also that you are going to be writing all the time. So Zan talked about this yesterday, right? The idea that some students will go into one discipline and be like, I don't have to write anymore. Wrong. You have to do this all the time. You will never escape. So a writing intensive course, even if it's not an English class, emphasizes that this is a skill you're going to need to have regardless of what discipline you are in. Collaborative assignments are exactly as their term suggests. So students working together to create a specific deliverable. I'm not talking about like a think, pair, share type deal. That's fine. We did that yesterday with Michael Heller, and I'm sure everybody does that to a degree in their classes, but these are larger stakes assignments. So these students are working together for a long period of time. In terms of students working for a long period of time, undergraduate research, a lot of these students get really early and active experiences hands-on working with their instructors on specific projects. Usually these are research projects that were started by and are being run by their instructors that are a little separate from the courses themselves, not just because like, oh, this is not the class assignment, but because like they're only loosely connected to those, like the course level outcomes that be connected to a larger outcome. And those professors can help those students along to be able to understand here is what research looks like at a professional level and not what is just happening at the course level. I would imagine we don't have as much of that here. Like I mentioned earlier, this is largely being seen at like four-year institutions where they're really big into research. But if you can think of a time where you have had a student work with you on research that you have been doing, by all means, this would be the session to talk about it. Diversity and global learning. So focusing specifically on, I'm going to borrow LEAP's language, difficult differences such as racial, ethnic, and gender inequality. Those are just a few. Being able to talk about how things do not exist in a vacuum, and if we are talking about things holistically, right, then we are approaching them from what is ultimately going to be an intersectional approach. Some person's experience is not just to be seen through one lens, right? People have multiple things going on. So being able to examine all of those, being able to think critically about them. And then we know what an e-portfolio is. We're very familiar with that concept. I do want to reiterate something that was noted to the group that did the HLC session about Gen Ed last academic year. One of the HLC representatives literally told us e-portfolios are unsustainable because, largely speaking, colleges end up in the same spot that we were in last year, where things just are not working in the way that they are supposed to, which is one of the reasons why a lot of the studies that I read emphasized you can say that you are doing high impact practices, but if they're not being implemented well, it really doesn't matter, and it can often make things worse. So e-portfolios are great when they are executed the way that they are supposed to. And that's not a one person is at fault kind of thing. There were just some things that we didn't know about, right? Things just needed to be tweaked a little bit. But we are familiar with that concept. Service learning. I mean, Josh is our expert on that. Josh is really good at that. But being able to take students out of the classroom and being able to show, okay, all of these skills that you have learned in this class, let's now apply those to our local community, to the real world, making those connections. What you're doing here in this classroom does not exist in a vacuum. Not only is it going to be connected to the other classes that you take, but it's a real skill that you'll be able to use once you are interacting with people out in the community. We have internships, another form of kind of experiential learning. And then finally, our capstone courses or projects. We talked around this time last year about how when it comes to program level assessment, capstones are the best places to get that data because they're at that point meeting all of those program level outcomes. And the capstone project is how they prove that they do that. So most assessment here does focus on that program level content. However, a lot of the research I noted said that there are some elements of Gen Ed that have those capstones as well. It really does just depend on the campus. And for us, we focus a little bit more on program. So before we start talking about what happens at Mount West, do we have any questions about the basic definitions? Okay, cool. So if like an hour from now, someone was like, I will die if you don't tell me what high impact practices are, you would be like, I've got this. I'm going to save your life. Excellent. Okay, so what we're going to do is on this sheet of paper, and again, if you do not have a writing utensil, there are boxes of pens over there on the table if you need one. This is based upon this is a scaled down version of a model that was given to a collection of, I want to say like 25, 26 institutions where they had to rank their high impact practices by the following: either 0, not offered, 1 being it's optional, 2, it's required for some, but not all, and then 3, yes, this high impact practice is required for everyone. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and give you the answer to the first one. Do we have a first year seminar? Yeah. Is it required for everybody? No. So that one would be a 2, right? So you're going to fill these out and don't do it individually right now. If you're looking at one and you're like, I don't know if we do that, hold on to that. There's a reason I want you to have that thought. And then there's a question at the very bottom that asks the following: what high impact practices, if any, have you implemented? Briefly describe your experience. If you are unable to implement a high impact practice, What barriers of entry are you experiencing? Because that would be a good thing to discuss here. All right, I'll go ahead and pass these out. Please take one and pass it down. Does anybody need a pen? Yeah.
Here you go.
There's no wrong answers. We're trying to get on the same page. So again, we're gonna rank each individual 1, 0 through 3, and then answer that question at the bottom about your specific experience with a high impact practice, multiple high impact practices. Only you know what you're doing in your classes. Unless you've shared it. Yes, this is about your, the ranking is what you specifically are doing, right? If you can think of something that we do across the college, by all means, you can rank it that way. And then that question at the bottom is just about you.
Okay, so let me ask that question again, just to be sure.
Yes.
For instance, collaborative assignments, are we talking about in my course I have them do that?
Mhm.
We're talking about everybody who's here.
I want you to use your current.
The required for some, required for all seems like.
Sure. So do you think it's something that's required for everybody, or do you think it's something that's only required for some?
It's required for my students.
Yeah, so the first one is it can be college-wide, it just depends on what your current knowledge is. It's more just kind of however you personally want, you know. Because you might give something a 0 and somebody else would be like, no, we actually do that.
Can I have a definition of common intellectual experiences?
Absolutely you can. In fact, I'll go ahead and put it back on the screen. So these are, for example, if I need to take if I'm talking about English classes, it's like doing English 101 and then 102, like everybody is scaffolded in the same way. As opposed to, yeah, kind of. So think about your capstone class, right? Instead of people starting with capstone and doing class for free, right? It's doing everything except, and then they have those common characteristics. All right, about 1 more minute. All right, go ahead and finish that sentence on which you are working. So in thinking about writing about your own experience, but also thinking about what goes on around the college, one thing that was noted in some of the research that I was reading was that the systems that are currently in place in terms of correcting data are not designed to collect data about high impact practices. So a lot of faculty often ask, what does happen on our campus? What do we do at the capstone level. Do we do this high impact practice? 30% of the college knows, but the rest does not. Now, when it comes to communication around a college, basically every institution has that issue. We've been hearing about that a lot, the Achieving the Dream meetings and a lot of the breakout sessions I've been in. Folks that are at institutions that are much bigger than ours are like, oh yeah, we have these issues. Do you? You guys are small. And I'm like, no, we have it too. And a lot of that, especially with regard to HIPS, is that these systems just kind of aren't created to measure this data. And a big issue there is that the institutions that are often saying, oh yeah, we do it and they're perfect. Are they perfect, or is it just a box that's been checked, right? And more on that in a second. Now, you've got your ranking, and then you've got a little bit about what you do in your class. So either your high impact practice or multiple practices, or any barriers of entry. Maybe, hey, I want to do this. I don't have the space or the funding, or maybe the students haven't been as engaged as you wanted them to be in the last 2 years. The different barriers of entry can vary depending on the individual. What I want you to do now is I want you to turn to the folks around you, small groups. I'm not going to tell you how many people need to be in your group. I'm not your mom, you do whatever. But I want you to talk with some people around you about your answers for each one. And specifically, I want you to note what you said about your own experiences with high impact practices. And once you've talked, everybody's had a chance to say, all right, I do this and I do this. I want you to nominate a scribe. And that person's going to come up to the boards and note the things that you do. We are going to take pictures of these as part of our HLC evidence.
Too, because like, when you're talking about there are some folks, they're closer than others. You see it, they're fair. Like, should transfer. But like especially given the debate, like we're gonna hear like that's very but like yeah, if you're in the crazy group, it's like maybe you know. I think that's great. Funny thing, I put zero specifically because finding it tough as a leader is a great title. Like when I was but like I guess also it was probably different. I know.
We still have some time, but once you've got your stuff, remember you need to nominate a scribe, put it on the board.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I think I maybe get a little too long. I don't think what you're saying is that, but to get something like you have your course. So like actually. Collaborative assignment. They can tie it here. Yeah, yeah. I guess maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Think that this program require agent and that has that.
If you do collaborative assignment, whatever your answer was, that part, bottom part of the assignment sheet. Write your collaborative assignment up there. If you do FYS stuff, what do you do in FYS? If you create learning communities or common intellectual experiences, you have your answer at the bottom for the things that you do. Let's just put them up on the boards. No, yes. Yeah, there are plenty of markers up there.
Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and get to the bottom part. Yeah. Exactly. We got that there. Even got I thought sometimes talk about their try to build a little community around our fear. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's fun. It's not the worst thing. Okay. And that's kind of. You're right. I don't see I'm working on it. IT hands on model. Yes, sir. Yeah, we did the whole.
I can get to.
Upstairs.
It's like half the screen, you know what I'm saying? But I don't know how to work it, basically.
Drive duty.
I'm not, but, Sleepy with Charles, our go-to, the kids. Go on. Sit out and they've got.
Yes.
All right, let's take about 2 minutes to finish with the boards and then go back to our seats, please.
Okay. I'll go
Yes. You can have it. Okay. Go ahead and finish up what's happening at the whiteboard. As we can see, lots of different cool high impact practices already happening here around campus. Now, when you were in your groups and when you were thinking about your own experiences and thinking about the definitions that we covered earlier, how many of you found that you actually do more high impact practices than you thought you did? Okay, all right. Who here was already aware of like, I know what high impact practice I do and okay, cool, excellent. If we even leave with just a few people realizing all of the cool things that they're already doing, that's great. How many people, anybody come up with okay, this is something that I'm interested in? Anybody coming up with any ideas of things they think they might want to do in the future? Maybe that takes time, right? But if we're thinking about something like the building learning communities or service learning projects, looks like we have a lot. So I know we have the PTA 5K, which is super cool. We have Deaf Santa, we've got graphic design, we've got marketing, we've got all kinds of cool math projects and our collaborative assignments. Lots of excellent stuff already happening here on campus, which is great for our ATD project. So how many of you know about the ATD stuff, achieving the dream stuff? Cool. All right. If you do not, this is a good opportunity to know about it. Show of hands. How many of you are part of the ATD team? Yeah. Okay. So it's the Seattle team, and then we've got Mary, we've got Jamie, we've got Sarah, Mike and Baker in there with us too. So we are ultimately in the planning stages thinking about not just high impact practices, but what things the college is already doing and what things can be improved. And there are a lot of different things that we are considering, a lot of research that we are reading. And this is a huge chunk of that. Now, in thinking about data as it applies to high impact practices and their success, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the research I read, a lot of those researchers went in thinking, all right, our hypothesis is that the implementation of these high impact practices will increase graduation rates or will increase student success. Some found that that was the case. Some found that it was not, in fact. So if we're looking at, and all of the research I read, by the way, can be accessed in Academic Search Complete. In the days before our winter break, I just sat down and got to be a student again and looked at stuff that was peer reviewed. It was fun. I enjoyed it. But one of the studies that I read from Academic Engagement and Student Success, do high impact practices mean higher graduation rates? The authors noted that, quote, these findings do not support our original hypothesis that first year seminars, writing requirements, learning communities, and service learning will be positive predictors of graduation rates, unquote. In fact, they found several negative trends, and I mentioned, yes.
Sorry, I have a question about the research.
Yes.
Did it note whether the colleges or institutions self-reported that they were doing HIPs, they were just checking a box, or did somebody evaluate, oh yes, this is indeed a HIP to the definition?
I'm glad that you asked because it's checking a box. In fact, one of the articles that I read, and it's in my bibliography, and I'll show it in a second. The title is Devil in the Details, and it talks about how high impact practices and specifically how they're reported very often does not get that big picture. So the authors were looking at this report that was talking specifically about global and diverse learning. And this student talked about how she had a really good experience studying abroad. And the college was like, yes, look at us. We did the HIP and it worked. And so the authors reached out to the student and they were like, hey, can you talk a little bit more about your experience? And she said, yeah, I actually studied abroad twice. One was really great. The other sucked. It was awful. I had no support. Nobody with the college would get back to me. My home family was awful. So in that case, did the high impact practice work? No. And granted, right, in that first experience, the other one where she did have a really good experience, she did have consistent communication with the college, stuff like that. In that case, yeah, the college did a really good job. And there are lots of people working at a given institution. Sometimes things fall through the cracks. But if we are just saying, okay, this student went to Madrid, we did it, gang. No, that is not how that works. So yeah, in a lot of cases, they were asked to check that box. In fact, this study in particular is where this model came from that you were filling out. That was the first page of what they were filling out when they were talking about their high impact practices. Now, does this mean that they are bad and we should abandon them? No. But it does mean if we're going to do it and we're going to report on it, we need to be doing it the right way. And a lot of that does pertain to assessment, right? Maybe in the next time that you're thinking about one of your courses, let's say that you're doing your program assessment, you're thinking about your capstone course, and you were like, yeah, I do this high impact practice and this is the way that it works, but it didn't really work in this one specific rubric area. And then you tweak it. And the next time you do your program assessment, you address the thing that you tweaked and it got better. In that case, that's good use of a high impact practice because it's not just a check in the box, You're using it to improve student learning. That's the goal. So there are a lot of things to keep in mind when you implement something like this. And I do have, this is not completely comprehensive, but it is a list of some things you would want to keep in mind if it's something that you want to do. So first question, which of the HIPs is most applicable to your course and why, right? If I'm teaching English 101 and I am like, I want to do service learning, okay, maybe, I don't know if that's the best thing for that class. But there would need to be a rationale for why it is you're doing what you're doing, right? For English 101, that would not be the one that I would choose. Number 2, is this course part of a sequence? If you knew that, all right, this is the beginning of the first time these students are going to work together, but they're going to be in a cohort. They're going to be together for 3 or 4 semesters. All right, what would be the best thing to kind of get them acclimated? Number 3, will this course be taken by students in a learning community? Alternatively, could this course be connected to another course to create a learning community? I would love to see some like interconnected courses across disciplines on this campus. Again, are we going to have anything like that criminal justice and classics course that I took at Marshall? Probably not. We don't have a classics department. We are a community college. No one's talking about Nero here, which is fine. But we do have some cool things. Well, okay, no, I'm so wrong. Katie is talking about Nero and she's doing it in a fantastic way. But you know, we have some cool opportunities to do some stuff here on campus, and I'd like to see more of that. How will this HIP be communicated to students? It is not something that you can decide to do halfway through the semester. Usually these are pretty big. They are high stakes. The students need to know if you are going to be doing a service learning project, right? It needs to be in the syllabus. They need to know up front. This is an expectation. You are going to do this thing. How will it be assessed? Right? Again, can't just be a check in the box. We can't just say the students did it. Yeah, but did they do it well? I can say that a student wrote an essay. Is it a good essay? Yeah. And then finally, what resources, if any, are going to be necessary for the students to be able to complete this thing successfully? Sometimes you're not going to need anything. Sometimes there's extra funding that you need to ask for, which is fine, but you need those resources. We need that communication before you decide, yeah, I'm going to check this box. This is the thing that I'm going to do. Because ultimately, the impact comes in the form of the student experience, not you saying you did it. Because if we are telling HLC, we're talking about it at ATD, if we're saying whatever, yeah, we do all these high impact practices, but we can't talk about what that does for students, it really doesn't matter, right? So it really needs to be about what the students are getting out of the course. All right, do we have any questions, comments, concerns, anxieties about anything related to HIP? Not me. Yeah, like things that I can reasonably answer, like that email. All right. I do have my research again. If you're interested in this, I can send you this screenshot. All of my research was provided through Academic Search Complete, which again, if you haven't gone in and been a student and just like hit peer review and find a bunch of articles and read through them, it can be kind of fun. So if you're interested, that's there. And then of course, the QR code that is literally all over this room. Please use this to evaluate any of the CETL sessions that you are experiencing today. And if you have any notes from yesterday, you can do that too. And again, if you have questions about high impact practices, please by all means, let me know. If you are Gen Ed faculty, you are going to be staying in this room. We're going to be talking about student success Mike is going to be talking about student success. If you are program faculty, you are going to be headed to GO3, but you do have a little bit of a break, about 8 minutes. So thank you guys.